Welcome to The Long-Term Investor. Today I'm joined by Joe Saul-Sehy. Joe, say hello because I have a ridiculously long introduction for you and I want people to believe that you're actually on this episode with me.
I am. Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
I'm pleased to have you here, especially because in these uncertain times, the basics matter more than ever. And you and your co-author, Emily Guy Birken, take the basics and really make them fun in your new book, Stacked, Your Super Serious Guide to Modern Money Management. I'm pleased to have Joe with me here today for all of our listeners and all of our viewers on YouTube to talk a little bit about the book, as well as nerd out on some of the nuances within the book. And for those of you who don't know Joe, he is the co-host of mega hit show Stacking Benjamins, which you can easily find on your podcast platform of choice. You may remember we had his co-host OG on the show in February in episode 36, so go check that out as well. If you haven't heard of Stacking Benjamins, Kiplinger's Personal Finance has called the show, quote, best personal finance podcast. And Fast Company has described it as striking a, quote, great balance between fun and functional. I completely agree with these brand name assessments. And after having read Stacked myself, I can say that if you like the podcast, you're really going to enjoy the way that Joe and Emily hit the important basics in their book. Now, part of the reason this introduction is so long is that I just found out that Forbes was naming their top 5 personal finance books in 2022, and Stacked was listed as number 1. And in addition, Axiom does awards for business books, and they give out gold, silver, and bronze medals. The book took home a gold medal. And of course, I'm going to link to the book in the show notes. You can find the show notes always by visiting thelongterminvestor.com. Okay, Joe, I'm finally done introducing you. I've never done such a long introduction. A little behind the scenes, I usually mess up the introduction for anyone who listens. I never get it right on the first time. But I really do want to actually dive into some specific topics you cover in your book, Joe. And first of all, you're a podcaster, right? That's how most people know you. I'd really be curious to know what surprised you about the process of writing the book.
Wow. When we make a podcast, which is 3 days a week, our podcast comes out very, very frequently. We feel it has kind of a Tonight Show vibe. So we're always creating something new and forgetting about the last thing. The book is much more permanent, right? And the idea of revise, like if we could revise our show over and over and over, I'd totally do it. Because I think the key to success most of the time is in the revision, not in the first draft. Like get the first draft down and do it. But I feel like with our episodes, it's not that we are done revising, it's that we run out of time, right? So we had a lot more time to continue to polish and polish and polish. We actually, it's funny, we turned in 120,000. We didn't turn it in, but the first manuscript was 120,000 words. And our deal with the publisher was it was going to be 80,000. So we had to cut a third of the book. And talk about George R.R. Martin killing his darlings in Game of Thrones. I felt like we did that with so many cool financial topics. I'm like, nope, that's got to go. It's got to go.
Well, that's the benefit of the weekly podcast platform. You can expand on those ideas and it gives you nice, cool content to give to your listeners, your readers, your viewers, if they ever need it behind the scenes. And I also know that you're on a book tour. You're not in your basement as the Stacking Benjamins basement right now. I know you're on the road, so I appreciate you being here and squeezing me in. One of the things with the book, well, actually, before I get back into the book, the thing that's in the book, but also in your show, is that you've always seemed to spend a lot of time on people's mistakes, whether they're your own or your guests or your listeners who are submitting questions. Why do you think that is?
It's because of the fact that so many people are intimidated by money, and you and I, people that have met with real people and talk to lots and lots of real people, we realize that we're all worried about the same stuff. We're all making the same mistakes. And yet when we get together, at happy hour or our families get together and the kids are playing, like you don't sit with your buddy while you're grilling the burgers and go, hey, guess what I screwed up with my money? But I think we need to do that more often. And I'll tell you how important this is, because I truly think that we need to relax the discussion more and get comfortable with some truth. There's a great study called The Secret Financial Lives of Americans, and it's written by a group called Nonfiction. I'd encourage everybody to read this study, Peter, because it has so many disturbing statistics. But like people that have eaten out of a dumpster, or every place I've worked, you've accused somebody of stealing somebody's food out of the refrigerator, right? And who would do that? Well, the reason people do that is because of the fact that unbeknownst to you, they have huge credit card debt and they are seriously not even living paycheck to paycheck. They don't know where they're eating the next day. So there's all these horrible statistics, but the one that really hits me hard every time I think about it is that over 150 million Americans report that they've cried about their money. 150 million people. And it's funny because initially when I read that, I thought, okay, that's got to be the part of America that's living paycheck to paycheck, right? Not sure where things are going to happen for them the next week. And while that's true, that's a higher percentage of people making $250,000 or more a year. Nearly half of those people say they've cried about their money. So clearly, we have this huge problem in America where our values are going one way and our money's going a completely different direction. And while it might be about increasing your income, it's much more about getting into these discussions that we need to have. And we can't have the difficult conversations if we're always just bragging about our money. If we're talking about the cool crypto thing or NFT thing that I bought, I don't think people are crying because of NFTs, because they didn't get in on the 8-bit tree. The picture of the 8-bit tree. Or people like you and I, they're always like, well, Peter, what's the hot thing in personal finance? What is it? Well, okay, it's that the mega backdoor Roth IRA might go away. You think people are crying about that? The fact that they might change those rules? I don't think so. So I think for us to get to those deep conversations, these values conversations we need to have, we need to lighten the tone. And I think the way we do that is people like OG and I share what we've messed up. And then we encourage everybody to, hey, let's get a little real about this. Let's talk about some of the huge mistakes that we made with our money. So you know that people, Peter, like you and I, we're not born just all of a sudden doing money moves correctly. That's the reason I like talking about mistakes versus how brilliant I am with my capital.
Well, in school, you're given a lesson, then a test. And in life, you're given a test, and then you learn the lesson. And those money lessons can be really expensive. And so I always appreciate the honesty and transparency that you and OG share those mistakes, and also encourage your guests to share those mistakes. And I think that allows your listeners, and when you run your forums in the communities, your people who are following you, to also share their mistakes and learn from them. And one thing that I think you pointed out in the book is that mistakes happen all across the board, but people really mess up their plans from the very beginning. They ask the wrong questions, and that can make the process all the more difficult. One of the things that you talked about was a timeline and writing out goals. And I talked about writing about goals in my book. And I think that we, as people who are giving out advice and coaching others to make good decisions, know the importance of writing out goals. But I really liked the way that you framed how to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I found this was powerful. I haven't been a financial planner for 13 years, but when I was a planner, this was really great. It was a fantastic exercise right away with my clients and future clients and people I meet with. We'd on a whiteboard, instead of listing goals out, just goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, goal 4, like we do with, with our New Year's resolutions. And how many people listening to this are still working on their New Year's resolutions? Probably maybe 2. Most everybody else is done. And the reason is, Peter, real life shows up. And so these New Year's resolutions get pushed to the back as I'm taking the kids to school or doing whatever I do on my daily drive. So daily walk to the other room in my house to be on Zoom meetings all day, whatever it might be. But because real life takes over, it's important to bring them back to the front. And I think the way we do this is we make our goals fight against each other. So we look at them, and we are visual. When we're born, we don't know language yet. We have to learn language, but visualization is something we do immediately if we have sight. And so I really like this idea of a vision board. And I think doing that with your goals, where you put yourself and anybody else you're planning with on a piece of paper, landscape style, and you draw a line across that represents the rest of your life. So they're you today, a line that's the rest of your life, and then draw some circles, which are the bags of money you're going to need to reach all of your big goals. So let's say that it's 2000, the year 2000, and it's me. I, in 2000, had 2 kids I really wanted to put through college, my spouse, Cheryl, and I wanted to be financially independent at some point. I was just getting my financial house, my foundation together after really messing up my money bad in the 1990s. But now I had this foundation. I'm saving aggressively. I'm investing. But I've got these two really big things that I want to do. I really don't want my kids to have credit card debt, but I also don't want them to have student loan debt. And I also know that I want to be able to do whatever I want to do when I want to do it. So I put those out on a timeline, and then I ask some basic questions. Question number one is, what do each of these goals cost? In other words, how much money do I need to save today? And what rate of return do I need on my money? And what this does, by the way, Peter, is something very powerful that's a side thing. Everybody used to come into my office with FOMO, right? This fear of missing out on the hot investment. Joe, everybody's talking about this investment. Everybody's talking, should I put my money in this thing? Is this good? And the cool thing is when you do this timeline exercise, you can get rid of, is it good as a question? That's the wrong question. The real question is it good for me? Is it good for this goal? So I grew up in West Michigan in farm country. And if you think of your investments like we did when we would plant fields, you have a growing season. So if I plant corn in the middle of January, it ain't going to make it, right? I plant it in a certain time in April or May, and I harvest it in August or September. And we know the number of weeks, like generations upon generations know. It's actually the same for investments. So now it's okay if my buddy at work has an investment for me to say, that sounds really good, but it doesn't meet my goal. And now I can, instead of being an inch deep and a mile wide, trying to know everything about every investment, now I can be very deep on the few investments that actually meet my goal, the investment types, and I can really get nerdy about those things, which is really powerful that when you actually know what the bumpiness of the ride's going to be as you get invested. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you take all of these items and you ask, what do they cost me today? How much do I need to save for each of them? And let's say you can't get them all. My friend Paula Pant at a great podcast called Afford Anything says you can afford anything, but not everything, right? And now if I can't afford all my goals, Peter, now I have these really cool values discussions. Is it more important for me to pay 100% of my kids' college or to be financially independent at 50? Like, which one is it? If Cheryl and I have a discussion about that and we go, no, we really don't want our kids to have the debt that we had coming out of college. Okay, well, guess what I got to do? I got to move the financial independence goal back, or I have to increase the rate of return, get riskier with my investments, or I have to save more money to get it all. I have to figure out the budget. So it actually is really cool that Cheryl and I then are able to have these what's more important discussions. Is there an ROI in college? I don't even want to put that out as a goal. Some people go, I don't know, maybe work, maybe there's value in them deciding, me helping as a parent decide level college plays in their life. But I think the world gets a lot cooler and you're able to invest in a way that you know why you're doing it. You know exactly, this is more important to me, this is less important. And you start putting those things in order, and guess what? You're less likely to cry about your money because you have the right investments. You have a budget for a reason, not just because you have a budget and you're supposed to. And you build milestones along the way to these different goals to make sure that you're on track for each of them.
I love that visualization. And actually, I rarely talk about this on the show, but I am part of a startup company that provides corporate financial wellness to Fortune 500 companies called BrightPlan. And actually, you can get a free trial by going to brightplan.com/simple, and you get 3 months for free. But ultimately, the way that we mapped out the timeline was the same way. You had this goal and why is it important to you? And we placed it on a timeline. And I think that's really nice that that's how you laid it out in the book, plus adding the cost and the expected return. Totally love that. But also people are, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, they're always comparing themselves to everybody else.
Yeah.
And, they want to know what's the best investment. And, really it's not about whether you have more than your neighbor's brother's cousin. It's, do you have enough to really reach these goals that you've set out that you think are important to you? So you mentioned college for your kids. Some people would rather their kids foot the bill themselves. Some people want them to go debt-free. Lots of people have lots of feelings about cheap college versus expensive, but what matters to you is all that's important. And once you have this visualization, you've done some of the planning forward. And one thing that I loved from your book is how you talked about budgeting is not the same as tracking. I don't know if I'm quoting directly from the book. Budgeting is looking forward. Tracking is looking backward. I have a Mint account. I've used Mint since, I don't know, the financial crisis. And I use BrightPlan a lot now because we have some of those same features. But maybe talk a little bit about that, Joe, how that has played a role in your own finances as well as those that you speak to on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get to my stuff, just a great analogy of somebody who got this wrong was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson did obviously a ton of stuff right. We wouldn't know who Thomas Jefferson was if he didn't do a bunch of stuff right. But Thomas Jefferson was a fantastic tracker of how he spent money. He wrote it all down. We know he was a dumpster fire with money because he tracked it so well. And the bad news is, even though he wrote it down, every biographer I've ever read of Thomas Jefferson said he owed everybody money and he was constantly under pressure with his creditors to do the next thing. And he was always having to stave them off. But it's because he didn't do the other side of that, which is when Thomas realized that he had a spending problem, he then had to plan a budget forward to try to get rid of that problem. And maybe he tried it, maybe he didn't. I don't know that part, but certainly tracking and seeing where you mess stuff up is an important part of the plan. The second part, though, is what do you do about it? It really depends on you. You know, a lot of people that I know, if they're able to get all their financial goals by putting that money on autopilot and automating it to go into the right account to reach those goals, then they spend the rest, right? That's the perfect anti-budget for somebody. Automate everything you have to do and spend the rest because we don't know how long we're going to be here. You can't take it with you. Well, I actually said this in the book. I said, I haven't been to heaven, but I don't think you can take your money to heaven. But I have been to Vermont, and people in Vermont tells me it's the same thing. And I just don't think you can. You can take it with you for that reason. People in Vermont, very braggy about their state, but rightly so, Peter. I don't know if you've been to Vermont, but it's gorgeous.
I have not. Maple syrup, though, right? Isn't that the thing?
Wonderful.
Well,
maple syrup.
You know, it's funny. I didn't mention this at the outset, but I didn't actually read your book. I listened to your book. I got it on audiobook. And I did that because I'm so familiar with Joe, the podcaster, as opposed to Joe, the writer. And so I would tell you I'm not a big audiobook guy, but one of the things that was so interesting, I know that at the end of many chapters, you have transcriptions of real podcast interviews. Whereas in the audiobook, it's more of an experience because we get to actually hear the clips of those guests. And so I think that was really nicely done. It makes it very unique for an audiobook experience. Plus, you have a tremendously great cadence and voice for it, naturally, because you do this all the time. Before I ask you more real finance questions, though, was that your mom who was in the audiobook?
So this is a great story. And by the way, even before I answer that, let me tell you, I was so happy with all the experts that agreed to be in the audiobook. So Gene Chatsky from the Today Show, Jill Schlesinger from CBS News, Phil Town, the Rule One investor, talking about investing, Money Girl, Laura Adams, Maury Tahirapur, who is a great negotiator for the NFL Players Association. Like when we talk about negotiating, so all these people, it was really cool when they said, yeah, you can use the interview in the book. But my mom, the podcast has been around for 10 years and we think it's fun to have these snippets, you know, of different things. And at the beginning of our show, and it just kind of tells people that this isn't going to be Susie Orman or Dave Ramsey. Like we're not going to be the people on high telling you that you're messing up with your money. We're going to have some surround sound fun and try to make this approachable for more people. Early on, I go to my mom. I'm like, you know, mom's always this off-screen character that you always know is upstairs baking or riding her Harley or doing something, but you never hear from her. So I thought, how cool will this be? So I take my recorder and I have mom do some snippets for me. Well, my mom, Peter, had me when she was 18 years old. And my mom sounds hella young. I mean, she sounds really young. She's 72 now. So you can do the math on how old I am, but she still sounds young. And in fact, my friends always say my mom has an incredibly young spirit, which is great. I mean, if you're in your 70s and sound young and act young, it's wonderful. But it ain't great for a podcast, Peter, when your mom sounds like your sister. So I do a lot of nonprofit work because I think it's important to be part of your community. And I think that giving is way more fun than receiving. So I'm on this board of this group in Texarkana, Texas, where I live, called Partnership for the Pathway. And we help the cities build walking trails, which are safe routes to school. It's one of the cheapest things that a community can do, a city can do, that raises property values at the same time. So there's a financial aspect, there's a health aspect, there's a beautification aspect. It's great all the way around. It doesn't cost a ton of money to build these trails around towns. And I'm at this meeting, and one of our founders, her name is Julie Ray Harrison. And for people that don't know where Texarkana, Texas is on a map, it's right at the corner of Arkansas and Texas. It's Northeast Texas. And this woman, Peter, has a wonderful older woman, very nice Northeast Texas accent. And I went, holy crap, in the middle of the meeting, we're talking about something else, like matching gifts to the city and this trail, the Nicks Creek Trail, and this beautification project. And all of a sudden in the middle of that, I go, holy crap, you are my mom. You are my mom. But now I have a problem, because I want Julie Ray to be my mom on the show, but I also had to break it to my mom that I got to fire her. I totally got to fire my mom. And so I call up my mom. I go, Mom, it's because you sound really young and you have a very young spirit. And she's like, it didn't work, Peter. She's like, oh yeah, buttering me up is not going to, yeah, really, you're firing me. But then she heard Julie Ray. So what was cool about this is that Julie Ray became my mom on the show. And when you hear snippets like, you can't play with that Ramsey boy till you eat your peas, or, you know, keep podcasting like this, you'll go blind. That's a funny one. So we have her say all these things, but we recorded those maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And our editor at Penguin, Nina Shield, who, by the way, is the same editor in James Clear's Atomic Habits. She's a fantastic editor. Nina says, so is your mom in the audiobook for us? Is your mom gonna read her parts? And I went, oh crap, I got to call up my friend Julie Ray, who hasn't done anything for us in 4 years, but it was really cool because they paid her. So I said, hey, good news. Penguin Random House wants to give you money to be my mom again. You want to do it? She's like, she doesn't say heck yeah. But she, in her very nice mom voice, she's like, well, certainly I'll play your mom again, Joe. It was really neat.
Well, when listening, that is hilarious. And when listening, I picture a little bun and thin glasses and a hot steaming pie in her hands as she's giving mom's money lessons. So I appreciate you letting us deviate. I'm glad I asked the question there. That's great. I actually have one more thing but there. I'm going to pivot back for our listeners. Oh, yeah. I actually have one more thing there that's kind of funny. So she swears in the book because I didn't know she was going to be reading it, right? So I have her say the S-bomb, not the F-bomb, but the S-bomb. She says it, and Julie Ray does not swear. And it was horrifying to her that word was going to come out of her mouth. So, but it's so in character for the character, but it's so out of character for her. So if you listen to the audiobook and you hear her say the S-bomb, she was not excited about doing that. Well, I know all the stackers listening to this episode are going to love the little inside baseball they get there. So thanks for sharing that, Joe. And I'm going to pivot back into the world of finance. You know, one of the topics you covered that's not exactly a sexy topic is insurance. And you covered it very thoroughly. But there was one concept in particular that really resonated with me, and I think it applies well beyond the insurance decisions that you have to make. And that's really the concept of thinking through financial choices in the context of what would happen if, instead of what insurance should I buy, or how much insurance should I buy, or should I have an investment, or an emergency fund, or how should I prepare for a market downturn? You know, asking this question, what would happen if, really seems powerful. You know, if you have an emergency fund in place, your insurance priorities are going to change. And I think you sort of point out the fact that you should prioritize your expensive policies and ignore the cheaper ones. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Yeah, because that kind of turns it on its ear, and it's really, well, you want me to buy expensive insurance is what you're saying, Joe? And it's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they've done the homework. And by the way, insurance companies are in the business of making money, and insurance is an important part of a financial plan. So knowing a little bit about how it works, I think, can really, really, really help you a ton. You'll either save money or maybe spend the same amount of money and have adequate coverage versus having these coverages that don't match. And the first way we do that is we get away from the sales speak that insurance companies like. They want to be a part of the conversation because they want to make money, right? So the conversation is that they want you to have is, do you value this type of insurance?
Is this an insurance that you should have? That is not the question you want to have. It's not a horrible question. It's directionally right. But the bigger question, to your point, Peter, is not about insurance. It's what is my biggest risk? What are the risks and how do I cover those? So when I was a financial planner, I had a client who built roads and highways in the state of Michigan and was an engineer. And she told me whenever their team would build a road or a highway, the first thing they would do is what are all the things that could go wrong? And they'd eliminate as many of those as possible ahead of time before they built. And that's the discussion that we want to have. And then maybe insurance is a piece of the plan and maybe it's not. As an example, people complain about emergency funds and cash reserves. They complain that this money earns nothing, Joe. It earns zero. Why wouldn't I just use my credit card or my home equity line of credit if something bad happens? Well, there's a lot of dangerous things we can talk about there, but the ROI on your emergency fund is not the rotten interest it pays. It's in the fact that in your car insurance or your homeowners, you can raise your deductibles and pay less. So actually the savings that you're getting from Allstate or Progressive or Geico or whoever you have as your insurance company, that savings you get, you can think of as the interest you're getting on top of that crappy interest rate on your emergency fund because you have freedom from worry and you can self-insure. You can avoid short-term disability insurance coverage, which is very expensive because you can be your own short-term disability coverage if you have 6 months in a bank account. With all this madness going on around the world right now and the uncertainty of financial markets that result from all of this horrible stuff going on, you can afford to wait that out and not blow up your plan because you have an emergency fund. So there's all these ROIs about bad things that emergency funds help you handle. And I think an emergency fund, for that reason, is the core of your risk management strategy. But then beyond that, the reason you look at which insurances are more expensive is because insurance companies have these people with really thick glasses sitting in windowless rooms in the back. And by the way, the people that do this, I know you're laughing because actuaries know all the best actuary jokes. Every actuary I know knows the stereotype. And by the way, they're not usually that stereotype, Peter. They're usually very nice people, but they're sitting in a back room with all these charts because what happens, whenever I hear somebody say that an insurance company is ripping me off, I think maybe the salesperson's ripping you off because that can happen. But the insurance products are hella competitive and they're state regulated. And because maybe you can fool a state regulator for 6 months, maybe 12 months, but these companies have been around forever. So let's just have the assumption that the policy is they're not gouging you for this huge amount of money that they're keeping in their pocket. Certainly they're going to get paid and they're going to make a profit. But the vast amount of money that they're collecting from you is because that actuary knows where the risk is. They've run all the charts in this windowless room in the back of the insurance company, and they know. So because of that reason, the insurance companies that cost the most, they cost the most because the insurance company knows that's where the risk is. And they charge the least on policies where they know the risk isn't. And I'll give you an example of an insurance that I always see people get wrong. So often I see people get this wrong. Accidental death and dismemberment coverage. It's in your flexible benefits at work if you work for somebody else, and it's really cheap. And people look at this and like, oh, this is a form of disability coverage. Well, kind of, but accidental death and dismemberment coverage is made so that if you lose a finger in heavy machinery or your arm in heavy machinery, they will pay you a sum of money that helps you with that. A lot of people with accidental death and dismemberment insurance work in cubicle land. And now they don't even work in a cubicle. They're on Zoom calls at home. They're typing away on their computer. So what's the chance for most people listening to this, Peter, that while, firing off another memo, they snap their index finger off between the J and K key? Like it just isn't going to happen, which is why that insurance is cheap. So what I like for the vast majority, now, if you're heavy machinery, it's a whole different thing. You probably want that insurance. But if you're a person that just types stuff in your house at home or in a cubicle, I would get rid of your accidental death and dismemberment coverage because the chance of that happening is very low, which is why it's cheap. And I would add more disability coverage, which is hella expensive. And the reason disability insurance is hella expensive is because the statistics say, those actuaries know, it's probably going to happen to you. So make sure that you have that one.
Well, and I like that you bring that up because most people I come across, and I also recommend it to people who are working with who don't have it, have life insurance. When they're in their young working age. And it is cheap when you buy term insurance in your working years because you're unlikely to die. If I were quick enough, I'd pull up a statistic, but there are plenty of studies out there that show that you are far more likely to become disabled before age 65 than you are to die. And I think what people forget is that disabled includes getting cancer, And when you ask that what if question, what if I am ill and I'm out of work for 3 months? Well, that's where that emergency fund can come in handy. And like you said, it's very expensive coverage, that short-term disability, but long-term disability, also not cheap. If you have enough of an emergency fund to float you for the early months and develop a policy that doesn't kick in until your emergency fund is depleted or has been used a little bit, that can save you a little bit of money. But there's no winning in insurance. You can't win in buying an insurance policy the way that you can refinancing at the correct time.
Yeah.
I have a 2.5% rate on a 30-year mortgage. I feel like I won that transaction. My disability policy, I write a check every January and I want to barf. But I know that the statistics say that I should do it, and there are ways to adjust the policy if you have that cash reserve on hand. And, Joe, just to kind of go further down that what would happen if rabbit hole, I think of what would happen if you get a job offer that has less cash compensation, but a lot of lucrative equity compensation that wouldn't pay off until the future? Or what if you have a substantially higher tax bill than you're expecting? Or what if you experience some sort of loss that isn't covered by insurance? These are all things that when we use the word emergency fund, those don't seem like emergencies. I guess the loss that isn't covered by insurance would be an emergency of some sort. But it was with you actually, Joe, in a conversation with you earlier in the year where I'm thinking we got to rebrand this to cash reserve, because you can also be opportunistic with investing.
Yes.
And you talk about investing within the book and the normalcy of losses and having a plan. Let me ask you this question and how you would think about it if you were talking to a listener or to someone who meets you. What would happen if the market falls 20%?
The frustrating thing for most of us is that when the market falls 20%, I think and it's funny, I was at one of our book events last night and we were talking about this very thing, which is a lot of people say, well, don't panic. Don't panic when the market goes down 20%. I think it's okay to feel the feelings. And I think trying to suppress the feelings is absolutely horrible, because those feelings are going to come out in bad ways. I had clients during 2000 to 2002 that told me they couldn't sleep at night. Clients in 2007, 2008 that were worried that even though they had their job right now, that they might not have their job later. And I like, by the way, thinking about risk, Peter, not in terms of 20%, but think about this. If you're an average person retiring, we talk about how $1 million used to be a lot of money. $1 million now is a $40,000 a year lifestyle in retirement. Not horrible, but also not lifestyles of the rich and famous. So if you have $1 million, which should be fairly commonplace at retirement, and you lose 20%, you lost $200,000. And it's funny because I would have clients that would tell me they're okay with 20% because 20% sounds fine. That when I rephrase that to $200,000, they go, oh man, that's a ton of living that I can't do now. So that is, I think, super important. But if we look at that, what if, the number one place to be for your investments long-term are equities and real estate. Those are the two inflation beaters that over long periods of time have won the day. However, when you look at the standard deviation, to get a little bit nerdy here, which is the roller coaster ride you're going to be on, especially with stocks in a short time frame, it's a roller coaster. And yet being in stocks is the right thing to do. So having this emergency / cash reserve fund that at that time when you're withdrawing money in retirement, that's fairly big. And, maybe having OG and I fight about this a fair amount. I think it's okay then to have bonds in your portfolio. He's not so impressed with bonds. He'd rather have a barbell where it's equities and cash. I'm more of a middle ground when you get to landing the plane, which is another phrase my co-host hates, does not like that cliche. But I think when you're in that mode, coming up with a strategy, not based on returns, but is based more on when's the money available when you need it, is another what if. What if I now have a burn rate, meaning I now am somebody who's no longer making money, I'm spending from the pot. Like, how do I make sure I have money available without really suffering from this risk that I'm taking money from assets that have gone down a ton? And that's where the emergency fund and I think a bond strategy really works.
Well, if someone's going to ask themselves, what if I just stay in all cash, then I never lose 20%? Well, you'll never get on your timeline visualization that you built. You'll never get there. I mean, it'd be great if we could all save enough cash, but the savings rate plus the length of time you would have to work and save would just be completely unrealistic. You know, you could go to the opposite end of the spectrum and say, what if I was all stocks? And emotionally, the toll with which that might take if you're falling 20%, that might be a little bit too much. And to your point, having a mix of stocks and bonds and cash, I'm generally there. Your co-host OG, I understand what he's saying, because in many ways, over 20 or 30 year periods, I feel like stocks, the returns are safer than bonds, you know, because they're more consistent, they're higher. But you can apply to what if you buy an individual stock and it loses 70% of your value? 40% of all individual stocks in their lifetime have experienced a permanent decline of 70% or more. I think this what if is really powerful as you're thinking through different stages of the plan. And what if you have something? What if you don't?
Can we talk about one more thing here before we move on? Because I think this is powerful.
Yeah.
What you and I are really talking about here, Peter, to dive a little bit deeper, is not the market. Like everybody asks, well, the market, you know, is the market going to be the problem? Is the market? And maybe, but over long time periods, like you said, stocks are safe over a 20-year period of time. So the problem isn't the market. The problem is behavior. And so what I like, once again, going back to standard deviation, is when I was a financial planner, I would look at standard deviation, and to not get too nerdy, if you look at this number and let's say your rate of return over long periods of time is 9% and your standard deviation is 14, without getting, once again, it's much more mathematical than this, but in most markets, you'll be 14 up from that or 14 down from that. So with my client, I could mathematically show them this is the roller coaster ride in most markets. And we could then, it's almost like the pilot coming on, telling us what the turbulence is going to be on the flight ahead of time. Another analogy OG hates, which is why I like it. I think knowing that turbulence ahead of time is so important, because we get in a market like we're in as we're recording this. And you already have, you can see it in the media. The media is already freaking out, right? You got people starting to freak out. What if the market now is gone forever? And this is the time when it takes some courage. But knowing what the bumpiness is ahead of time, the problem with an all stock portfolio, I don't think is the stocks. I think the problem is you. And can you handle what all stocks are going to give you when it comes to that expected bumpiness? That's the technical term I know they use. CFAs use that all the time, bumpiness.
I have my CFA designation, and yes, I that was in the textbook. I'm pretty sure it's been a while since I completed those exams, but I'm pretty sure that was in the level 3 textbook.
I'm sure, right.
For sure. Well, Joe, I would love to dive deeper with what if into everything, but I know we're running short on time, and I'm just kind of curious for our listeners who've enjoyed this conversation and enjoy your show, or maybe some who have already read the book. What are some book recommendations that you would give for people who want to dig deeper on some of these things?
Well, for a simple book, number one is I really like your book, frankly.
Yeah, I was hoping you might say that, so thank you.
Not to suck up to the host, but listen, what I really like about your book is, frankly, the fact that it's thin. And the reason I like that is because of the conversation you and I had at the beginning here, which is you just got to get into the water and you got to be okay with making some mistakes. And the fact that we get so uptight about our money, we don't do that. So the way that you simplify it, I super, super like that. You know, and I'm going to point to a couple books which aren't finance books, because I know people do that all the time here. One that I really like, that I didn't think that I liked when I read that, is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Because I think that sharpening the saw is so important. Even if you have financial advisors around you, you cannot, Peter, and I talk about this in my book, you can't abdicate the throne. You are the queen or the king, and your advisor is there to make you smarter. Mary Barra at General Motors is a CEO I have a lot of respect for. And Mary goes to all the meetings. She knows everything about a car. She doesn't show up at work and go, hey, advisors, you know, her VPs that run the different departments, how's this car thing going that we're doing? And a lot of people do that with their advisors, and that's horrible. So sharpening the saw yourself, even with advisors, I think is hugely important. Begin with that in mind is what we talked about with visualization. You get rid of a lot of this worry about, do I have the right investments? If I just start with the goal and work backwards, you're much more likely to have the investments that meet the goal. So I like that book. I also think, as a guy that really enjoys creativity, one of the things that frustrated me about a lot of people's financial plans, and not even their financial plans, just their lives, I think they didn't dream big enough. They dreamt too small. Like, what could I really do? It often bothered me when people would go, no, I've got $5 million. I'm going to be fine. Well, not to put stank on your goal, but good for you. There's 150 million people out there crying about their money. There's podcasts like yours, like mine. There's books. There's all this stuff, and we're still leaving people behind. You could do so much in your own community by thinking a little bigger. It's not just about you. And it's more fun, by the way. What you learn is it's more fun to bring your brother with you. So I love this little tiny coffee table book called Steal Like an Artist by a guy named Austin Kleon. And it's not a book you read end to end, but it's about take what other people are doing. If you think you're not creative and you're like, well, how do I think bigger, Joe? Look at what other people do. Don't steal it because there's no joy there, but remix it, pay homage to it, and make it yours. And so most creative people know that creativity is not built in a vacuum. It's built by being inspired by others around you. And so for me to get inspired, I think Austin Kleon's Steal Like an Artist is really good.
That was a wildly impactful book for myself. And it's a great example happening in the moment is I am taking this idea from your book in insurance on what if and thinking about the million different ways I can apply that to things I do. It's a really good example of finding someone else's work, putting it into your own words. And when you end up reading enough personal finance books, you mix them up and then you suddenly know what your own beliefs are. So could not agree more. That's a wonderful suggestion. I love that you threw that out there. I love that you threw out my book. I was sort of kidding when I say, I hope you would say that, but I could tell from your face that you might. And this is a little unplanned, but since we're talking about my book and looking at my bookshelf to see what I can offer listeners, I will say this. If you go to peterlazaroff.com/free book and you enter podcast is how you heard this offer, I will send out every book that remains on my bookshelf right now to those who submit first, and I'll see what else is at the PlanCorp offices and see how many. I don't have a ton, but go ahead, listeners, and do that. Joe, one more quick question to close out that I ask all of my guests. What does it mean to you to be a long-term investor?
I think it means, and it's funny because I'm going to give you an answer of something that I heard a very brilliant guy named Jason Zweig at the Wall Street Journal write in a column recently. Jason wrote that being a long-term investor is not what we saw the last 8 to 10 years. It's what we're seeing right now, which is that I think being a long-term investor takes some courage. I think it does take some courage. I think hanging in there is the key to your success. Another brilliant guy, a guy named Morgan Housel, was pointing out the fact that, you know, most of Warren Buffett's net worth happened after age 65, which, don't get me wrong, Warren Buffett's a pretty good investor, but before age 65, you could put him in a much bigger pool of people. But it's really the fact that he kept going that we know who he is. Plus, he writes brilliantly, right? He's a good orator and he's a great writer, so he can encapsulate what he does, which is another reason why we like Warren. But Morgan says, and I totally agree with this, we overemphasize in all these books about Warren Buffett and why he's successful, we overemphasize his brilliance about stock picking, and we underemphasize time in the market, which Warren has had a ton of time in the market. You, when you were on Stacking Benjamins, talked about the power of compounding interest. And I think that being a long-term investor means remembering we're after that compounding. And you can be pretty damn average if you let the money compound longer. You can get where you want to go without having to be brilliant if you are a long-term investor. So I think courage and time in the market is the two pieces of the recipe that I like.
Great stuff as always, Joe. Thank you so much. Maybe you could share with the listeners where they can find you, and I'll be sure to stick that in the show notes as well.
The Stacking Benjamin Show we call it the greatest money show on earth because it is a circus, as you know, Peter. I'm not interested in teaching you. I'm very interested in surround sound and getting you interested enough in these conversations that you want to have more of them. So you spend more time here with Peter or with any of the brilliant people that we try to curate for people. So stackingbenjamins.com is the place, our show where you're listening to us now every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Well, thanks again, Joe. And for listeners, please be sure to subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. That will help you not miss a single one of the great guests that I have coming before and after Joe. And also, if you're watching us on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment. That's going to be influencing who comes on the show next and what we talk about. So thanks so much for joining us. And until next time, to long-term investing.